Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Public Affairs Center, I welcome you all to this evening's event. I'm Archana Muthappa, and I'm a member of the PAC's board. I'm very glad to be here this evening. May I request our panelists for the evening to come and sit up here, and I would like to introduce you. Please. As most of you are aware, PAC was established in 1994 as a think tank to develop evidence-based research as the base for public policy. PAC's research utilizes social accountability tools and is geared towards an inclusive approach to the community. Today, PAC's research is centered around the 5 SDGs, including primary education, health, livelihood, skills, and gender, bringing to life outcomes based on robust data analytics. As India celebrates the 75th year of our glorious country's independence, the panel of distinguished speakers has come together to discuss the Constitution of India as it impacts our future. The topic for this evening is Revisiting the Social Contract Imperatives for the Future. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our eminent panel for this evening. Chairing this evening's session is Dr. A. Ravindra, who is the chairman of PAC. Dr. Ravindra is also the chairman of the Center for Sustainable Development. Dr. Ravindra joined the Indian Administrative Service in 1965, and having served in various capacities in the government across departments, is today a fount of knowledge and experience. He retired as Chief Secretary to the Government of Karnataka at the end of 2002. Dr. Ravindra holds a PhD in Development Studies and has specialized in the urban sector. Mr. Sudhish Pai is a distinguished lawyer and jurist and an acclaimed author. His contribution to academics, particularly in the area of critical constitutional analysis, has been both substantial and significant. He was a visiting chair professor of the Ashutosh Mukherjee Chair in the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences in Calcutta and is a resource person at the National Academy in Bhopal for continuing education for judges. Mr. Pai is a contributor to the restatement of Indian law on legislative privileges, a project of the Supreme Court. A renowned author whose writings have been quoted at the Supreme Court and both high courts, his writings have included checks and balances to rule of law and constitutional adjudication to the law of writs. Due to his academic profoundness, he is often referred to as a legal philosopher. Welcome, Dr. Pai. Mr. M.R. Srinivasmurthy is the chairman of the 6th State Pay Commission of Karnataka. He served as chairman of the Karnataka Electricity Regulatory Commission between 2010 and 2015. As an officer of the Indian Administrative Service, Mr. Murthy has held various positions in both the Government of Karnataka and the Government of India, across several departments including Finance, Rural Development, Bangalore City Corporation, Election Commission of India, and ISRO. Welcome, Mr. Murthy. Ms. Anita Gurumurthy is the Executive Director and Senior Fellow of IT for Change, where she leads research related to economy, data, and AI governance, democracy in the digital age, and feminist frameworks on digital justice. She actively engages in national and international advocacy on digital rights and contributes regularly to academic and media spaces. Ms. Gurumurthy serves as advisor and expert on various bodies, including the United Nations Secretary General's 10-member group in the support of technology facilitation mechanism, the Paris Peace Forum's working group on algorithmic governance, Save the Children's ICT 4D Brain Trust, and is on the Mindroot Tech and Policy Labs board. Welcome. Welcome to you, madam. Mr. Pranay Kotasthane is the Deputy Director at the Takshashila Institution, where he chairs the institution's high-tech geopolitics program. He teaches topics related to public policy, international relations, and public finance at Takshashila's graduate and postgraduate programs. Mr. Kotasthani's current research is focused on semiconductor, geopolitics, and policy. He co-writes Anticipating the Unintended, a newsletter on public policy ideas and frameworks, and co-hosts Pulia Bazi, a popular Hindi-Urdu podcast on politics and policy technology. Before joining the Takshila Institution, Mr. Kotastane has been a part of two Fortune 500 companies where he worked on integrated circuit design for mobile processors. Madam and gentlemen, I thank you all for being here this evening. We look forward to this very interesting and engaging discussion. With this, Dr. Ravindra, may I request you to begin the session?
Distinguished panelists and Director PAC, Mr. Gursharan, and friends, let me also, as Chairman of PAC, add my word of welcome to all of you. It is nice to see a gathering like this with a lot of young faces when we are going to discuss a very important subject pertaining to what Gursharan has very imaginatively termed as the social contract. In the first place, when I read the word social contract, I was a bit confused in the sense, what is this contract he is talking about? And only much later I saw the fine print below about the Constitution and its future and so on and so forth. But anyway, just to uh, provide you a little historical background about the social contract. You know, this term social contract came into prominence during the 16th, 17th centuries when three very eminent political philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the first two from England and the third from France, they debated this question of the social contract, and each one had his own view. Basically, it meant that between individuals, to begin with, individuals and society formed a contract, in earlier days. And then it turned into contract between society and the government. So Hobbes in particular, earlier what he called the state of nature. And he felt, there was a lot of chaos and confusion where, it was individual war against another individual waging wars, and where the life was, he says, um, short, brutish, nasty, and so on and so forth. So the individual surrenders his sovereignty to society or later the state. According to Hobbes, it was you had to surrender everything, all your rights. But John Locke was the person who said it is only partial because there is a contract between the two. And if the state fails, then the society will have to act. I mean, that is one. Of course, Rousseau, the great prophet of the French Revolution. Uh, so all these Locke's, particularly writings, was what inspired the American Declaration of Independence. And the words like liberty, equality, and not to begin with, it is property, life, liberty, property. So these words are now taken for granted, which we use in our constitution also. But I think the origin came from the thoughts of John Locke, who is considered a very, very great political philosopher in several ways. Of course, Rousseau talked about what is called the general will, the will of the people, which is rather a vague term. But anyway, now we have progressed quite a lot, and today, when we are going to discuss in a very different context the Indian situation, I must say. So, from independence or pre-independence days, the colonial days, when the constitution was to be proclaimed, India achieved independence in 1947. I think it is very good to recall those moments, at the time when we achieved independence and independence was declared, and Jawaharlal Nehru, in his very famous words or speech on Tryst with Destiny, he spoke about how India awoke to life and freedom on the midnight of 15th August 1947. So we are now nearing 15th August 2022, 75 years of independence. And now this new social contract, I might say, is what the Constitution provides. I mean, what does the Constitution say? What is the contract? when we say that we, the people of India, so it begins with the words, we, the people of India, give ourselves to this constitution, etc. So we, the people, have a contract with those who are expected to govern or rule or whatever word that you might use. Uh, the constitution by itself does not really define the powers and all that of the state and things like that. It only says, I mean, in the preamble, of course, where we say that we want to provide justice, economic, social, political, and liberty, equality, fraternity, and all these words come in. But these are all like there's the preamble, in a sense. So how do we do this? What is exactly the contract? In my view, I think you should go back a little to the uh, before the constitution came into force, to the debates of the Constituent Assembly. So it was in before we achieved independence in 1947 January. The Constituent Assembly passed what is called the Objectives Resolution of the Constitution. So this Objectives Resolution was he stated that we are going to give ourselves this Constitution in order to for the governance of the country. The word governance appears in that Objectives Resolution. It doesn't really appear substantively in the Constitution except in the directive principles of state policy, where it says the governance part comes in the directive principle. So it may not be enforceable by courts, but it says those principles should guide the future governance of the country. I mean, and then of course it goes on and it's all those. So on the one hand we have the institutions of the state, parliament, state legislatures, executive, judiciary, to whom the people have in a way delegated their own powers, I mean their own authority to govern. So how has this contract worked all these years, all these 75 years? And then what is the future like, and how are we going to shape the future? I think I am not going to elaborate on this because I think yesterday's article in Deccan Herald by Mr. Gursharan, I think he has very cleverly timed it. That provides the background really. Much has been achieved, but much more needs to be achieved. So whatever we have achieved, certainly we have overcome poverty to a great extent, but still there is still a lot of poverty, abject poverty, although the numbers might have declined. We improved our literacy, our health standards, etc. But still, we still find stunting amongst children. And, of course, the COVID-19 has brought back the problems of health. This is one of the future imperatives, I would say. What are you looking at? And if people are not going to have good health, everything else becomes farce in a sense. So whether it is education is also in a mess, in spite of new education policy. We find, I still almost every day, we discuss in our house, family, because my grandchildren go to the school. So they still carry heavy bags with all the books. Right from morning to evening, they are burdened. And during the COVID time, primary school children were, given this online education. They had to sit morning, afternoon with their eyes strained and all that. And what kind of an education is this? On the one hand, and then in NEP goes on to say it should be a joy for learning and so on, all high-flowing words. We are very good in rhetoric. I mean, I think. So how do you look at the future is now the big question. So I'll not take much time because mine is only introductory and setting the context. We have certainly a very, very distinguished panel. I think I must congratulate PSC for having brought them all together on the center stage with different backgrounds. With these few words, let me now call upon Mr. Sudesh Pai, legal expert and jurist, and certainly to provide the legal and the constitutional angle to this new social contract. Thank you.
Good evening to all, distinguished panelists and distinguished members of the audience. Dr. Ravindra has given us an excellent background to the discussion that is now set for today. The social contract, what it signifies, legal philosophers and political philosophers, John Locke, John Hobbes, and Rousseau. Yes, the Indian Constitution is also a social contract. We, the people of India, gave unto ourselves this Constitution. He referred to the objectives resolution that was moved by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru in the Constituent Assembly on the 13th of December 1946. There was a very incisive, elaborate, comprehensive debate on the objectives resolution, which was passed, if I am not mistaken, on the 22nd of January 1947. And that provided the bedrock on which the constitutional edifice has been raised. The Constitution of India is perhaps one of the finest creations of human ingenuity. It represents a high watermark of consensus in our history, draws out the best from our past, provides a considered response to the needs of the present, and is resilient to cope with the demands of the future. There has been a study about 11 years ago on the lifespans of the constitutions. And the average lifespan is said to be 19 years. Very few constitutions survive beyond 50. I think all of us can be really proud that we have survived, not just survived, we have worked. Of course, there are a number of flaws that are part, but I think, and particularly, we must all admit that we are like an oasis in the desert that surrounds us. All our neighbors are, well, you don't have constitutionalism and a constitutional state around. So with all our drawbacks, with all the problems that we may have, I think we as Indians, as a nation, have much to be proud of. 72 years of working on the Constitution is no small achievement. Was one of the factors that the authors provide is specificity of provisions, flexibility of the amendment process, and I would add robust judicial process too. So all this has really helped us to work our Constitution. The Constitution does not require any tinkering, but we must perhaps think how we can work it better. But that's, of course, easier said and done, because what Dr. Rajendra Prasad said when we adopted the Constitution on the 25th of November 1949, said, all that we require is good people to work it. We must still say the same thing, and perhaps our descendants would continue to say the same thing, because man is man. And the René Cassin, the principal architect of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, when he was awarded the Nobel Prize, said, you need a Bill of Rights, you need a constitution, because man is not always good. That perhaps is the truth, and we have no escape, because there is no other place where we can jump from this planet. Having said that, the Constitution of India is a charter of power granted by liberty, not a charter of liberty granted by power. What underpins the constitutional scheme is constitutional supremacy, which in very simple language would only mean that the different wings are all confined to the powers given to them by the Constitution. And no one can transgress those boundaries. It's a garment of limited powers. whichever wing it be. So it's the idea is that when we say social contract, we have given unto ourselves the constitution and the scheme of governance, perhaps the value of liberty and the value of justice underpin this social contract, and that's what the preamble, as Dr. Ravindra referred to, says. We, the people of India, having given ourselves this constitution to provide justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. The first three expressions are, of course, more popular and well known. I would emphasize the fourth, fraternity. I think that is what is absolutely necessary. In fact, Acharya Kripalani had said in the Constituent Assembly that the word is put, he said, when we are talking of this, the debate is almost at spiritual heights. And the expression fraternity was included in the Constitution, particularly for the reason that it was felt at that point of time that we need to build bridges, we need to have a concordial society. That need is no less today, perhaps even more. And therefore, I think it is essential that this aspect in the preamble, this exhortation, fraternity, is something that we have to develop, and that would make, I believe, the state of affairs in the country better. That would also make the constitution work better, because we must all live as a people, as one people. No doubt we have a lot of diversities. Those diversities are never to be forgotten or overrun. Unity in diversity is what underpins our culture, our civilization. In fact, it is said, in India, why do you talk of this or that? Why not we say this and that? In fact, this is what Dr. Radhakrishnan said in the Constituent Assembly. So I think this and that should be our guiding motto. Having said this, just a few thoughts. Now, one thing is that all the three wings need to be a little more effective, a little more efficacious. Of course, the first estate is the legislature, parliament. Great institution, but its twin objectives are lawmaking and holding the executive government accountable. I ask myself, how far is this happening today? Lawmaking, of course, many laws are made. In fact, perhaps we even have a diary of laws. And I wouldn't say that they are bad laws either, but it is important that there is greater debate, because debate and dissent is the heartbeat of democracy. Democracy is not just majoritarian rule. Of course, it is ruled by the majority, no, nothing else, nothing less, but still, in such a manner that you develop a consensus, a spirit of accommodation, and also tolerance. Tolerance, said Dr. Radhakrishnan, is the homage that the finite mind pays to the inexhaustibility of the infinite. So I think, and tolerance has always underpinned India's civilization. So we have to be tolerant of each other's points of view. There must be a sense of accommodation, and we have to build a consensus. And parliament is, and the state legislatures, the greatest institutions where this has to be endeavored and achieved. Of course, these things are easier said, but ultimately I think we will have to go on saying this so that sometime something may happen. That's the fond hope. The parliament would have to devote itself to a greater extent in lawmaking. Lawmaking, I would mean more discussion, both at the committee level and in the House. There is one other subtle point in the Indian constitutional scheme, executive power is coextensive with legislative power. We all know that. The executive government has the same powers in the absence of a law as the legislature. But Parliament, I'm talking only of Parliament, not the state legislatures. Parliament has not only legislative power, it has constituent power. Parliament is endowed with the power to amend the constitution, that's constituent power, Article 368. This is exclusively of Parliament alone. This power is not coextensive. The executive does not enjoy this power to any extent. And therefore, when constitution amendments are proposed and debated and carried through, Parliament as an institution should have a greater sense of responsibility and application. Of course, constitutional amendments are also moved by the government, and we all know that many times they are passed in a few minutes sometimes. Of course, this does not make these issues justiciable. I have no doubt about that. These are not matters for the courts. But still, this is what we as citizens would have to impress upon our own representatives in the hope that someday things would improve. I'm not so optimistic that tomorrow we would have a bright day, but we have to keep on talking. The other thing is holding the executive accountable. That's another very primary job of the legislature. Does that happen? Unfortunately, I think no. Today, after 1985, the 10th schedule also perhaps has contributed to weakening the legislative control over the executive, because everyone is afraid of the anti-defection law being applied. The anti-defection law, of course, it has both pluses and minuses, but I think paragraph 2 of the 10th schedule says that you suffer the penalty of the law only when you ignore or defy a direction. In the Kyoto Holon case, where the Constitution bench upheld the 10th schedule, Justice Venkatalaya speaking for the bench, it was observed that those directions are such which, if not complied with, would bring about or not bring about a change of government. It is not every discussion that a whip is to be issued and the legislature's mouth shut. It's only when there is a no confidence motion, of course, because then the chance of the government either winning or losing the confidence. And finance bill, because if a finance bill is not carried through, the government has to resign. And any questions of major policy, it is not every other area where the 10th schedule would apply. If necessary, I think this could be clarified by a constitution amendment so that, because members of the legislature have absolute freedom of speech in the House. The whole purpose is only to say that they ventilate what Dr. Ravindra referred to as the general will. John Stuart Mill also called it the general will of the people. So that is to be ventilated, and laws are to be enacted to represent to that will. Well, if the mouth of the representatives are shut, we would not be able to achieve that. So this is one area where I thought something really is necessary. And you know, of course, many laws are passed under the guise of money bills, which matter is pending before the Constitution bench. But well, we are not so much on the justiciability of that, but the morality of it. And we must also get over the obsession which we as Indians seem to have, that every problem has a legal solubility. No. Courts are not our only saviors. Believe me, if you believe in that, we are doomed. Courts have a very important integral part to play. They have done great work. They continue to do that. But everything can't be taken to the court and solved by the court. And it is there that, importance of the civil society, after all, that is what is important. And as they say, in a democracy, it's always, the democracy is a beckoning goal, not a safe harbor, because freedom is an unremitting endeavor. And no office in the land is as important as that of being a citizen. So I think the highest office is what all of us hold outside our other offices as the primary office, that is of being a citizen. And therefore, it is up to us to endeavor to do something, as Rajaji said long ago, national character. Of course, these are all very, as Dr. Ravindra said, very exhortative expressions, rhetoric. But then I believe that we have to keep on talking, because if we don't talk, then where do we? As it said, if you hold out your hands to the stars, you may fall on the treetops. But if your hands are only on the bark of the tree, we'll fall only in the gutters. We can't afford to do that. And therefore, we must keep on talking in the hope that someday something would click. Thank you so much. With these thoughts, I leave you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sudhish Bhai, for your very eloquent interpretation of the constitutional role of the legislature and other bodies. It's really very enlightening. I would now like to request Mr. Srinivas Murthy to give his views.
Good afternoon to all of you, Dr. Ravindra and distinguished co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen. So, Mr. Dr. Ravindra describing constitution as our social contract is a wonderful way of putting it. But most societies always have a social contract, right from the primordial times. We had social contract when the constitution was Varnashrama Dharma. In the society, there were 4 different categories of people. Somebody did something, somebody else did some other activity, and everybody respected those activities. Somebody was considered superior, somebody was considered middle, somebody was considered inferior, but everybody accepted it. So that was some kind of social contract. After some time, okay, that changed. And finally, our own people came up and said, this kind of, division of society is not intended even in our scriptures. Our Vedanta philosophy talks of every person being, having the same spirit. So there can be no division of people, society into classes and castes. So we are all one. Wonderful. To some extent, that guided the philosophy, I think, apart from Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. To some extent, that Hindu philosophy also must have gone into the framing of our constitution, which was a new social contract. This social contract also is subject to interpretation. What is a contract? A contract is actually a consensus that you have arrived at. Society arrives at a consensus as to how they should live together, and that's documented in the form of a contract, in the form of a constitution. But as times change, the interpretation of each one of these things may undergo some change. What is considered as justice today may not be justice 20 years later. Once upon a time, a certain kind of family system where the patriarchy ruled was considered fair and just. Today, equality of gender equality, is a new interpretation of justice between different genders. So this is a dynamic equilibrium. It's a dynamic consensus. So our constitution has undergone more than 100 amendments because the requirements of society, the requirements of the economy, the changing nature of the technology that society keeps using, the changing understanding of rights of different people, that governs the change that is required in this. In fact, any social contract can last. As Mr. Pai mentioned, the average life of a constitution is supposed to be less than 20 years. But a constitution lasts longer if it satisfies two requirements. One, it is capable of being interpreted and reinterpreted. And it should not be so rigid as to not accommodate changing views of society, changing requirements of society. And I think if our constitution has survived all these years, more than 7 decades, and I'm sure it's going to survive quite a long time from now, it's because it has accommodated those changing perceptions of what is the prevailing social consensus today. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory in the 75th year of independence and we will continue to live like this forever. There are many, many things which we need to really give particular attention to if we need to preserve this social contract and preserve our country as a nation, independent democracy. There are things which are inimical to continuation of our contract, and those things need to be addressed. Of course, Dr. Gurcharan has already mentioned in his paper that we have had several wonderful achievements. I can spend a lot of time describing many of those achievements, part of which we will take credit for as civil servants. That's a different thing. But the problems that are facing the society require our attention much more immediately. Politically, see, as a student of political science, I have seen the nature of political discourse in our democracy has undergone a tremendous change. 45 years ago, when I used to watch the assembly session in Karnataka, I used to see that there used to be very learned arguments for and against any particular proposition put in the assembly while making laws. But there was mutual respect between parties. And they would make all kinds of agitations, all kinds of arguments, but still there never were occasions when they showed disrespect for each other. Today we don't see that either in the assembly or in any of the political gatherings that we see outside the legislature. We don't even see it in the parliament. So does this indicate that our social contract is getting eroded? Social contract is nothing but the consensus of the society, the way we need to work together, the way we need to live together. So the moment you look at a person or a person of another political party, if you flare up and if you argue in language which is not very, very friendly, you are eroding that very basis of civilized discussion in an exalted institution like the parliament of a country. So this deterioration in the quality of political discourse is a serious threat to the social contract that governs our country. Then there are occasions of institutions being undermined. Many years ago, I had the privilege of working with the Election Commission of India as its principal secretary, when Mr. T.N. Sheshan was the Chief Election Commissioner. And I would just cite, one fine morning Mr. Sheshan asked me, do not in any part of our stationery in the Election Commission identify yourself as part of government. We asked him to sign a TA bill which said signature of government servant, TA form, traveling allowance. He said, I am not a government servant. I don't belong to central government, I don't belong to state governments. I'm an independent commission. Can you talk of that kind of independence of the Election Commission of India today? Probably not. What about the Supreme Court of India? Pardon my, Mr. Pai. How independent are they working? That's a question we all need to worry about. There are people who are anxious to please the executive in the courts. That is a very sad thing. So this is another aspect of our system which is undermining this particular social contract that we talk about. Coming to economic factors, equality is one of the noble ideals adopted in the Constitution. It's part of our. What has happened to economic equality? I'll come to social equality later on. Maybe in terms of social equality, we have done better. People who consider themselves untouchables, or society considered them as untouchables, they have asserted themselves and they have come up to positions of respect. Now we have, all kinds of, high offices being occupied by people who couldn't have dreamt of it in pre-independent India. So in terms of social equality, probably we have done much better. What about economic equality? The incomes, the average per capita income in the agricultural sector, this is what the economists say, is less than 1/10 of the average per capita income in the non-agricultural sector. And 50% of our population lives in the agricultural sector. At the time of independence, the disparity was only 1:2. Non-agricultural incomes were on the average double the agricultural incomes. Today, agricultural incomes are 1/10 of non-agricultural incomes. Can this be sustained? There will be someday unrest of such a scale that there will be no social contract sustainable which will protect this kind of an economic system. Inequalities of income and also the kind of structure of employment that we have. Close to 90% of people working are in the unorganized sector, with only about 10% in the organized sector. And unlike in the past, when those who worked on land were illiterate, not aware of their rights, not aware of their strength as citizens of this country, today most people are educated and they are part of the so-called gig economy. And how long will they tolerate this kind of inequalities? The top 1% of the India's population, it's estimated, owns 22%, gets 22% of India's income. GDP, 22% of India's GDP is earned by 1% of the population. 33% of the wealth belongs to that 1%. 50% of India's population has only about 6% of the income. Now, this kind of widening inequalities will not, will not preserve our constitution. These are all threats. These are not legal threats, but these are things which will build up into some kind of a situation when an explosion or implosion will take place. And we will have a very major problem. Now, the last concern, of course, you can go on listing dozens of these concerns. The religious divide we have always had, even before independence. And the country was partitioned because of that. When we wrote our social contract, we said we will give equal rights to all. As of today, we are all equal. Whatever we were earlier, that's a different matter. That's how Dalits, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, everybody has the same kind of equal rights. And now a discourse is being built up about going back to the past and talking about whatever happened 100 years ago or 500 years ago, 600 years ago, and then reopening these lessons and then trying to whatever consensus has been built up, trying to disturb that consensus. This is again another thing that will disturb the social contract that we have. Whether you talk of love jihad or land jihad or whatever jihads you have, all these things. These are not the issues facing the people of this country. The people of this country want to get ahead economically. They would like to get ahead educationally. They would like to be ahead of other countries in terms of achieving progress of various kinds. We can't be bogged down with this kind of issues. If organizations like PAC were to conduct a survey of the people of this country, what do they want most? They would like better standard of living, better education for their children, better healthcare facilities, better infrastructure. But I make non-essential issues of some hijab or something else as a big issue and make them forget those real priorities. These are some of the concerns that as a student of this society, I feel we all need to worry about. If our social contract, which is social consensus, which is by no means cast iron thing, cast in, any kind of, stone. It needs to be interpreted, it needs to be changed from time to time, but it can't be disrupted. Because we have suffered enough in this country in the past. We need to get on as a peaceful nation, as a united nation. That is the concern that I have. And I think one of the remedies that we should really focus on getting good education to all the young people and the children of this country. Education is a great levelizer. But look at the disparities in the field of education. You have an NGO called, I think, Pratham, coming up with a finding that a government school child cannot read second standard book even though he is in the 5th standard. And you go to a convent school or some one of those things, every school these days calls itself international school, I think. The old-fashioned description was convent school. Now they all call themselves international schools. So you go to any international school, of course, which collect some 2 lakh rupees or 3 lakh rupees per year. Well, their educational achievements and the kind of opportunities they get in their lives are much superior to the kind of opportunities that are available to children going to government schools or in the villages. Now, this is again another important problem that we are facing. So, sooner or later, we must get all our representatives to address these real issues rather than diverting our attention into various other issues of small or big nature. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivasmurthy, for really raising all the basic issues facing the country today on the eve of the 75th independence anniversary. I think a lot of thought needs to go into the issues that have been raised. I would now request Srimati Anita Gurumurthy, Executive Director, IT for Change. So let us see what are the changes she proposes now.
It's an honor to come after Sri Ravindra, Mr. Murthy, and Sri Pai. I certainly can't do that extempore. So I have collected my thoughts, and maybe I'll take 10 minutes to lay them before you. So I stand here as a person who has reaped the rich rewards of independence. Independent India tries with destiny and its efforts to provide citizens justice, equality, and liberty. But I stand not alone. I stand in a complex formation, somewhat like the human pyramid in Mumbai during Janmashtami. I don't know how many of you are Mumbaikars, but I grew up in Bombay. And have you ever witnessed those dahi handi pyramids, where people will climb on top of each other's shoulders, and then of course there's the booty right on the top, and then you break it and it falls on you, and then sometimes there's money, and in certain places there's a lot of money. So then that's really, that's the human pyramid. Of course, I'm not getting into the ethics here or the controversies about the dahi handi human pyramids. The clay pot filled with yogurt. There's the young men and boys who form teams, they make this human pyramid, and they attempt to reach or break the pot. It is a public spectacle. Everyone is cheering and all that. The lowermost in the pyramid need to be strong and sturdy. The middle need to balance those on the top and pay attention to the bottom. And the youngest and the lightest climb up right to the top. Sometimes even a child will climb up to the top. The entire sport is a balancing act on many counts, and imagery, a very vivid imagery of intergenerational roles, duties, and interdependencies. I'm not sure where I stand in the pyramid, certainly not the nimble youth who climb to the top, maybe the middle that's struggling to balance. I work with IT for Change, and the organization has worked to interpret the digital paradigm from the standpoint of justice, equality, and liberty. This, as we know, is a subject that is getting vaster and vaster, the intersection between digitality, digital rights, and our contemporary ideas of equality, justice, etc. There are questions concerning society at large. What kind of ethics and norms do we need for democracy in the age of social media? How should we aim to democratize voice while also privileging debate? Because you can't have a debate on social media, certainly not. How do we make space and create a place for those who have been in the margins, when those oppressed traditionally in our social structures, women, Dalits, and emerging core publics, such as queer folks and the differently abled, may find the online environment extraordinarily inhospitable? Then there are questions for the economy. And this is about the intersections between digitalization and the economy. How should we make digital resources widely accessible? What is the role of governance and regulation in enabling the benefits of technology to be taken to the last woman standing? What are the ways in which small traders, women's enterprises, and the youth are able to participate in the digital economy? And how are historical aspects playing out in what seems to be the new refrain, as you said, sir, of the gig economy? The beauty of ideas, of text that reflects ideas, of rhetoric, as you said, Sri Pai, of the minds that imagine precepts with abiding applicability, comes to rescue in these times. Which is why this discussion today on our Constitution, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's conception of constitutionalism, provide brilliant ideas for structuring our digital society and economy. And I'm going to attempt something of a quasi-pseudo theory of how we can borrow from that vision. Ambedkar saw in his mind's eye the weaknesses of the Hobbesian traditions of the social contract theory and its simplistic basis in reciprocity. In a society of mind-boggling pluralism that all of us agree, the country that is, and extreme stratification, politically based reciprocities or even obligations he knew would not be enough to tackle moral obligations. How do we change mindsets that are baked and cemented through centuries of caste and gender hierarchies? Ambedkar hence rejected the notion that the people give willful consent for the state to be their guardian. He sought an idea of the humane, the idea of a society that would recognize every person as fully human. extricating the constitutional person, rescuing the constitutional person, as it were, the constitutionally born Indian, each one of us and others, from the dehumanizing social structures that render some as powerless and not deserving of liberty, dignity, or equality. He was a feminist ahead of times and in many ways a theorist of the economy that we often do not recognize or remember. Ambedkar believed that an individual is not a means but an end in himself, and the purpose and aim of the society is the development of the individual. These ideas bear close resemblance to 21st century ideas that Amartya Sen, has labeled the equity in the distribution of freedoms. How profoundly imaginative. What do we take away from this for the ideas of digital society? That's the question. Being human is a luxury for many in the era of the platform-mediated public sphere. A society where everyone is fully human is an aspiration, therefore, that we must closely embrace. Digital space treacherously and unforgivingly reinforces social power, leaving those who are socially vulnerable doubly disadvantaged. Why? The problem today is not just that regressive social forces silence the less powerful and squelch their voice. Trolls in the online space dehumanize their opponents by orchestrating a theater of indignification. What our recent research about women on Twitter, my organization's research, finds is that all women who hold public opinions, and especially those from minority religious communities, are trolled systematically. They are denied their full personhood, the right to be fully human, which, according to Ambedkar, is the basis of fraternity, another name for democracy. And he asserts, democracy is not merely a form of government, it's primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoined communicated experience. It's essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards one's fellow men. And also, in terms of our social status today, not just economic status, we shouldn't forget that the recent Global Gender Gap Index 2022 ranks India as 135 among a total of 146 countries in the Global Gender Gap. And we are the worst performer in the world in the Health and Survival Subindex, where we are ranked 146. Ambedkar also believed in a sophisticated theory of economic governance. Scholars point to how, by 1947, when the debates of the Constitution had already begun, Ambedkar came out with a radical solution of nationalization of land and collective farming. Of course, he would always discuss ideas of the Russian commune and qualify why he believed something was very different from that idea, what was appropriate to India, etc. And we have to go to the history texts to see this. During the process of framing the Constitution of the Republic of India, Dr. Ambedkar proposed to include certain provisions on fundamental rights, specifically a clause, which didn't make it, of course, to the effect that the state shall provide protection against economic exploitation. Among other things, this clause, and to roughly summarize, proposed that key industries shall be owned and run by the state, very unfashionable today. Basic but non-key industries shall be owned by the state and run by the state or by corporations established by the state. Agriculture, very important, shall be a state industry and be organized by the state, taking over all land and letting it out for cultivation in suitably standard sizes for collective farming by residents of villages through groups of families. As part, and this way he thought you would actually break the caste structure, right? So everyone has access to patches of land which technically is in the public domain, but the actual laboring will happen through communities. As part of his proposals, Dr. Ambedkar provided detailed explanatory notes, and these are a pleasure to read, on the measures to protect the citizen against economic exploitation. He stated, and I quote, "The main purpose behind this clause is to put an obligation on the state to plan the economic life of the people on lines which would lead to highest point of productivity without closing every avenue to private enterprise, and also provide for the equitable distribution of wealth." The plan set out in the clause, which he had proposed, proposes state ownership in agriculture with a collectivized method of cultivation and a modern form of state socialism in the field of industry. It places squarely on the shoulders of the state the obligation to supply the capital necessary for agriculture as well as for industry. Ambedkar's economic thought and ideas of cooperativism that is backed by public investment in creating the productive infrastructure is crucial for the data economy that today has been hijacked by unprecedented corporate power playing with the quality of our democracies. Article 39B of the Directive Principles of State Policy clearly invokes ideas of fair distribution of a community's material resources. And today, data is a resource, it's an economic resource. Indeed, as digital and data resources become crucial determinants of human rights and access to resources, it would be imperative to harness data's potential for the economy through principles of community access, use, and benefit sharing. At this conjuncture, as we witness not just inequality, but a rapacious dispossession of the most marginal, just think of how your data is being monetized by the digital companies. Ambedkar's deep faith in decentralized democracy, vision of collective laboring, and view about the role of public infrastructure have never been more crucial. They point to the need to shape the social and the economic aspects of digital living through the enduring but sadly missing ideals. Coming back to the story of the human pyramid and the hunters of the Dahi Handi in Mumbai, if we assume the base layer represents the past, its history and artifacts, the middle layer, the fragile present, and the uppermost layer, the hopeful future, we can imagine how enmeshed and entangled social time and space are. The configuration of tomorrow rests on the solidity of the base and the reflexivity of the present, the middle layer. We have seen the Dahi Handi Ramas of Mumbai sometimes collapse like a pack of cards. I have seen that. They bring down the beautifully delicate, yet otherwise resilient structure, held together not just by the physical, but the moral power of the pyramid. At 75, whether the young people seeking hope, the promise of a new sociality, can reach the Handi and have their Dahi is very much a function of the new norms adequate to digital society. Norms that are rooted in the morality of the Ambedkarite vision. No constitution, however bold, inherently carries the quality of contemporaneity. The power to make constitutional morality a compelling companion is in the ability of society to reclaim the fractures and fault lines, the fraught contentions that created that morality. The debates that animated the constitutional morality of India are by no means gone. Social, political, economic, cultural, they're very much alive. It's upon each of us, therefore, to give our constitution the infinite power of reinterpretability in shifting time-space through ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity, which, as Ambedkar contended, is the sum total of justice. He said there's no separate thing like justice. It's ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity. So we need to give that reinterpretability that is appropriate to our life and times. The Constitution is for us, no doubt, but we too are for the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. I think that was especially for reminding us about Dr. Ambedkar and his ideas, and of course relating the whole thing to digital society and constitutional morality. Thank you. Now, may I request Mr. Pranay Kotastane?
Yeah, so the eminent part of the panel has already spoken. I am the part-time batsman and part-time bowler and tail-ender batsman here of the team. Okay, so think of it that way, and I'll talk about what I thought. Since most of the points about the constitution are already covered, I'll make the canvas broader and talk about social contract as in what Rousseau meant in the beginning, like social contract between us, between you and me, right? And from that perspective, I thought of like 5 imperatives for the future, which I wanted to talk about. So the first imperative is the imperative of societism. Now, this is a word that doesn't exist in the dictionary, but societism, by that, what I mean is often we think of society as a patient on which the state or the market operate, and society not as a change maker by itself. But societism brings into this idea that we need a balance between these three: the state, market, and society. And that is a necessary thing, and socialism is more statism than societism. So we need societism in that way to bring ourselves to solve a lot of problems, right? And that is what this idea of civil society brings. And India has that rich tradition of civil society initiatives, right? Rabindranath Tagore talks about this, that state always had a marginal role in our society, and it was the communities which were doing a lot of things. Now, of course, we can't bring those things in today's age. There were lots of problems with those issues as well. But what we don't need to forget is that society itself can be a change maker. So either through various means, through civil society initiatives, social movements, through philanthropy, etc., there are lots of modes through which society can bring in a change, and that's something that we need to emphasize. So a lot of recent work has been, Raghuram Rajan has written about the third pillar. Rohini Nilekani has recently brought out a book on Samaj Sarkar and Bazaar. So there is this idea of we thinking about how can we reimagine the social contract between us, not just between the state and the society, right? So I think that is one key idea that we need to think. And also it is important because oftentimes we think that solution to everything is the state, but because a lot of our failures are social failures, the solution also has to come from the society. So I think that is one important thing. Just like Mr. Pai said that, courts cannot solve everything, similarly the state cannot solve everything. It's for us to also reimagine our own social contract, and one essential part of that would be to build in social capital, to also build this bridging bonds, that is people across communities, how can we come together to solve problems instead of letting the state do it and us becoming mere petitioners to the state. So that was my first imperative, the imperative of societism. The second imperative is the imperative of parsimony. And what I mean by that is the imperative that the state should do fewer things and do them well. Now, the essential problem, the paradox of the Indian state is that it is too big and yet too small, right? So, we have a state which imagines and its ambitions are very wide. It wants to do many things, but we end up in this situation where there's a paradox between that ambition and that competence. So, there is lots of things to do. We want the state to do everything from, everything from also have protect our languages, ensure that things are good on our roads, and ensure that people are wearing helmets and whatnot, right? But a state which is trying to do so many things with so little resources is most likely to fail. So what we need to hold the state accountable to is something we need to reimagine in our social contract. Instead of expanding the kinds of things state should do, we need to hold the state accountable to basic public services, law and order, health, education, the core things that we talk about in the state, instead of imagining the state to do a lot of things that we wanted to do. And therein we'll find some of the institutional gaps if we focus ourselves on these particular goals for the state. So that was my second imperative. The third imperative is, I think, strengthening the republic. The imperative of strengthening the republic. Oftentimes, there's a lot of discussion on democracy, that whether there is too little democracy in India or too much democracy in India. I think that is beside the point. What is more important is the republic. We often talk about this. There's a difference, right? So, democracy, as Mr. Pai had mentioned, is rule by the people, and of in practicality it is ruled by a majority of the people, right? And in a pure democracy, it would be possible for 99 people to decide that one person should be punished because that one person doesn't agree with the remaining 99%. In a pure democracy it is possible. That's why in ancient Greece democratic states, you had Socrates being killed was a sanction of the state, and it can happen in a pure democracy. But it can't happen in India because we are not just a democracy, we are a democratic republic. And it is a republic which protects the individual's rights. It is the republic which says that irrespective of what the majority might say, or what 99% of the people would say, certain things can't happen because you are a citizen of India, right? And you can't be discriminated against, your rights are protected because of this conception of the republic. So I think over time we have moved away from strengthening that republic. The republic is weakening in a sense, and I think it is important for us to get together and strengthen the republic. And as I said, in a republic, it's the constitution which limits the rights of rights of even the persons who are in the government from doing something against that in a majority of one, which is the individual. That's why strengthening the republic is supremely important as we go ahead. So that was the third imperative. Fourth imperative, and I'm sure many people here would disagree, but I would still say the imperative of growth and economic growth. And I say that because when we say a lot of times about inequality, I think the central problem for us is poverty. Still 22% of the people are below the poverty line. So the idea in a poor country, we have to focus on eradication of poverty, and the best way of removing poverty, as we know from across the world, is economic growth. So oftentimes there are new fashions. Sometimes it is happiness, or Bhutan has this gross national happiness, so why don't we adopt that kind of ideas? But the idea is that unless we have growth, and we have lost that over the last 10 years, it has reduced, we will not be able to remove poverty from this country, right? And that should be the supreme goal for us in India, where 20% of poverty still exists, right? And there is a lot of studies on this. There is a lot of study that national development is not just empirically necessary, but also sufficient for human well-being. And national development has three components: a responsive state, a capable administration, and most importantly, economic growth, right? So at our level of development, economic growth is supremely important, and we need to focus a lot more on how we can improve that engine, so that in the changed world and in our new future, we are able to have remove poverty from India completely. So that was my fourth imperative. And the final imperative is, I think, the imperative of hope and reassurance. I think it is important because there's a lot of uncertainty, whether it's in the global order or whether what's happening generally within India as well. And that uncertainty breeds anxiety. That anxiety breeds distrust, and that distrust often breeds defeatism, right? And it is for us, all of us are elites here, so it is for us to ensure that there is reassurance in this world where there is so much uncertainty, right? If there is defeatism, nothing can change. So when I say hope and reassurance, I'm not talking about the self-aggrandizing type, that there's nothing wrong and we are already the greatest country in the world. We aren't. And that's what we need to do. There are a lot of problems, but through communicating hope and reassurance, I'm sure we can make changes. And we have lots of examples from India's own. I speak specifically about public policy. A lot of examples from our own public policy experience over the last 75 years, where very good policies have come up, very good consensus have been built in order to bring in positive changes. So I think it's critical that we convey an imperative of hope going ahead in the future, right? So with this, these were like the 5 imperatives I thought I'll put before you as provocations. And with that, I end. Jai Hind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kotestane, for those 5 imperatives that you have laid out before the audience, starting from a new concept of societism to finally, generating hope, because without hope, we will be lost. It's very good thoughts. Now I think we'll throw it open for discussion for about 10 minutes, some questions from the audience. Please.
A very good evening to the dignitaries on stage, the audience and dignitaries off stage. I'm Aryan DJ, President of the Student Council, BMS College of Law. Well, I must say it is indeed an honor to listen and also get an opportunity to interact with such great luminaries of the legal field, the political science students, and also of the public administration. Well, it is such a dynamic nature that we stay in of what we were and what we are today. But then I'm going to keep my questions very short. We were speaking, I heard the dignitaries speak about, especially Mr. Srinivas Murthy sir. You spoke about how we are subject to change, how the constitution allows us to adapt, and also it is subjected to evolution each and every year. But my question is, how we see democracy today is very different from what we saw democracy in the previous years. Even today, we see people, the majoritarians, as I might say, being coercive in their ideologies. They are not open to suggestions, they are not open to the comments that the individuals or the minorities have. So my question is, as Mr. Pranay rightly told, of course, the concept of republic would protect any individual from being ostracized or from being, thrown out of the society. But then, what if the majoritarian chose a point that they would go in full speed ahead to be coercive? As a country, as students of public administration, how would we stop that? How would we
Okay.
bring a barrier to that? Thank you.
Would you like to say?
Well, that's a $1,000,000 question, really. That's the risk that we still have of the social contract being disrupted. And the ultimate guarantee, to some extent, this could be from the courts, which will say that you cannot steamroll the minorities just because you have those numbers in the parliament. Ultimate guarantee is the good sense of the people. A majority steamrolls a minority, overrides the opinion of minority, as long as they feel that they are going to retain that majority. And when they perceive that the consensus of the society is for harmony, not for disruption, then they will also change their, way of discourse. So it is for the citizens ultimately, and particularly the educated citizens and the media and all those who are responsible for generating this public opinion, that we must send out signals that we value harmony, we value friendship with all the communities, coexistence. We do not want disruption of our way of life. That message must, when you see on the social media the kind of messages that come, which are absolutely unacceptable to all of us, we keep quiet. We think, oh, this is nonsense. We just keep it aside. But we don't react. We are not sending out counter messages that, no, this is wrong. We need to lead a different kind of life. That kind of message should come strong. As long as majority is silent, those who think they represent the majority will try to do whatever they think is in their interest. So we should avoid silence and we should speak up. Thank you.
Thank you. Next. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Srijini, and I'm really grateful to be here and part of this enriching discussion. My question is to Pranay sir. As you talked about the policy and policy formulation and research being getting mainstream in the society, and a lot of policies are getting formulated and which are good, bad, and certainly they are debatable. But at the same time, I wanted to know your view on the implementation part of these policies. Like, where do we stand when it comes to the implementation of these policies?
So there are many luminaries here who know implementation side better, who've been in the government. But I'll talk about it from a theoretical point of view, right? Many times when we talk about implementation failures, they are actually not implementation failures. There are theory of change failures, right? When we talk about policy change, you will say there is some input applied, and then that input leads to certain output, and that output will produce certain outcomes, right? So that there is a theory of change. We imagine that applying these inputs will lead to those outputs and finally those outcomes, right? Many times when that doesn't happen, we say that the problem is with implementation. But at least from my reading, I sometimes feel that good policy, bad implementation is many times a myth, actually, because the policy itself was not formulated well in the first place. The theory of change was not articulated well. I'll give you an example, right? So when we talk about education itself, so education, what is the input, right? So you have input either through people, teachers, buildings, etc. And that is the input. We are thinking that will lead to an output, which will be that people will graduate more, their gross enrollment ratio will increase, and finally the outcome from that would be that the learning outcomes will be met, for example. But now that there is one way you can say that because the outcomes have not been met now, that this is an implementation problem. But maybe it is not an implementation problem. There's a theory of change problem as well. Maybe we were focusing on the wrong things. Maybe that input that we were thinking that, just because we will have good buildings and we will have more people in will lead to that change. Maybe that was the basic problem, right? So now we might need to think of other inputs. Is the problem with the way the education is done in government school, or can it be done without a government school? If your final outcome is better learning outcomes, is it necessary that the government should produce it? Of course you can give vouchers to people who can't afford it, etc., etc., right? So that when you think of theory of change issues instead of implementation, you can then think of alternative solutions. So I guess I would say there that it's not just implementation which is the problem. Sometimes it's the theory of change which fails.
Right, sir. Just a follow-up question on that. When it comes to the feedback loop for any policy to understand whether it's working or not, a lot of times it's very difficult for even the policymakers or people who are in that field to understand or to receive that feedback loop. In the first place, to see what is the gap when it comes to working on that policy. So a lot of times, a lot of policies are revamped and a new policy is created. It's almost like you're hurt in a place, but the bandage is over another place. So, what do you have to say on that?
Again, there will be people who will know this better, but again, from my perspective, there's some. So, when you talk about feedback, right? So, yeah, if you are working in an open loop system, there is no feedback, these issues are. But I guess now Indian governments also, many at all levels also have this idea of a pilot, etc., right? Those are ways to do closed loop feedback, right? So we there were for DBT, etc., there were lots of these schemes where there were pilots done to learn things and then improve that. And also now there is this idea of pre-legislative consultation which has come up, right? So those are mechanisms which are, I guess, being built now to address exactly the problem that you mentioned. Yeah, can it be done faster, better? Yes, but I think that is already something that governments realize and are working towards.
Maybe Srinivas Murthy would like to say something about implementation.
Thank you, sir. This is one of the shortcomings of our, shall I say, system of public administration, actually. We think of policies, we have all the enthusiasm while launching it, we get the budgetary support. We don't design mechanisms of sound and timely feedback. We wait till people point out a lot of corruption or a lot of misuse of resources or wrong results being achieved by a particular policy and all that. So one of the ways of doing this is that while we design a particular policy or a particular program, you also identify ways of getting feedback periodically, so that you keep on monitoring this, and whenever you find that something is going off the mark, you take corrective action. And that's the way you can conserve the resources and make policies more effective in their implementation. That's a lesson we need to adopt in our public administration itself. Thank you.
Yes, please. Next, anyone?
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
My name is Vishwajit. I'm from BMS College of Law. It was indeed a knowledgeable session, sir. So my question is to Sudesh Pai, sir. Sir, you spoke about anti-defection law 10th schedule. So my question is, there must be certain rules or laws made in pending of cases related to defection, where some of the states where you can see the speakers are having the pending of cases related to anti-defection laws. Like I have seen many cases. So they postpone it till the next assembly election, sir. So there must be certain rules. And even in British, sir, there is a speaker is strictly a non-party member. But India, it is not something which we have to think about it.
Thank you for raising that very pertinent issue. The speaker is, please sit down, please sit down. The speaker is supposed to be non-partisan. The convention, see, most of the things, I mean, everything cannot be put in a constitution, and the constitutions to be worked and interpreted also by conventions. We have borrowed the parliamentary Westminster model from Britain. And I think one of the conventions which we have totally failed to imbibe is of the speaker being a non-partisan man. Of course, the first speaker, Professor Mavlankar, was an exception. So the speaker has, I think, either we must develop it as a convention, or if we fail to develop it as a convention, I think we may have to have a rule. The problem is, who is to make the rule? Politicians, we have a plenty. Statesmen, we must see where they are. If you have statesmen, this country would not have problems. And we had statesmen. I don't know whether we have them today, it's a larger issue. But you're absolutely right, the speakers must be non-partisan. And you would also notice that almost 20 years ago, the National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution had recommended that it must now go to another, I mean, not to the speaker to decide on the defection, or to decide on the defection, it must be vested in some other body. In fact, Justice Rohinton Nariman also in a judgment in 2020 or 2021 reiterated that. That again, of course, is for Parliament to take up and do. It would be good, it must be done. I totally agree with you that two things, that the speaker can't. You know, speakers have come to instruct lawyers where they had not to come. In fact, Mr. Soli Sorabji, when he was appearing for something, the speaker came, he had to almost shoo him away, saying, you can't come here, Mr. Speaker. You're non-partisan, you can't come and instruct me. Of course, the speaker, whoever he was, couldn't understand the idea. He only complained, oh, the council is asking me to go away. That's the level we have, what to do. But it's good that this question is raised. We have to evolve a convention and work on that.
Sir, one more follow-up question. Sir, there must be certain rules or laws made on the parliament conduct, sir. So every year you might have seen suspension of members from the parliament. So what's your opinion on that, sir?
Two things. Parliament is not supposed to be dead either. By this, I don't mean to support that Parliament must disrupt. But some boisterousness in Parliament is not unwelcome. It shows, you know, you're lively. But then, where to draw the line? Parliamentarians can't be disrupting. That leads us to another very important area, that it is equally the business of the treasury benches to ensure that the legislature functions and functions well. Parliament is meant to discuss, debate, and there is nothing wrong for the opposition to try to pull down a government. Whether they would succeed or not is another thing. But no government can consider it immune from any opposition or attack. So again, and we had excellent proceedings of Parliament. Well, today's scene, less said the better. In fact, Mr. Srinivas Murthy referred to 1977, but if you go back even to 1952, when you had such stalwart parliamentarians, and the bottom line is there was mutual respect for each other. Today, the level of discourse has come down to such low levels. We must, I don't know how to, what to suggest. All that one can suggest is our character individually, and the sum total of it is what you call national character, has to rise again. And we must have these principles, constitutionalism, in our psyche.
Sir, last question. clause 3 of Article 243D, reservation of Panchayati Raj in women for 33%, 33.3%. Sir, there are states which are given 50% of reservation in Panchayat Raj. So rather than using the word Panchayat Raj, can't it be from all forms of election as we are talking about social contract? So let the men, the parliamentarians of men, can they have a reservation for 50, same like 33, one third of the all election of the houses?
I think that bill is still pending in Parliament.
Okay.
It's still in the Rajya Sabha, it's not dead.
Okay,
Because with the dissolution of the House of the Lok Sabha, since the bill was in the Rajya Sabha, it is still pending.
thank you.
Any other question? Yes.
Yeah, good evening to everyone here. I'm Mahima Chowdhury from BMS College of Law. So it's been an honor listening to all of you, and I have a short question to the panel. As Sir was talking about all the civilized discussions and mutual respect to each other, I have a question. Do you think that having civil servants as part of the lawmaking process would make it less less complicated or more civilized way to make the laws and give more opinions? Because sometimes in my opinion, politicians or the political leaders have more of emotional touch to the laws, and when we include the executive part, that is the civil servants, it could be much more easier.
Please remember, Parliament or the state legislature is the lawmaking body. But in the parliamentary system of government that we have, as regards the legislature and the executive, there is more fusion than separation. Laws are never initiated by parliamentarians. I think Dr. Ravindra and Mr. Srinivas Murthy will bear me out with their rich and wide experience. Laws are always initiated by the executive. The policy is formulated in the cabinet. The cabinet is assisted by the permanent civil service. So your question that the civil service must be associated with lawmaking, please be sure it's only the civil service which makes the law.
No, sir, a part of the discussions in the houses.
Yeah, that of course has to be to the representatives of the people. And please don't think that their quality is poor. If only, see, the problem is this. Prime Minister Gujral addressed this 25 years ago. The problem is today parliament proceedings are shown. All that we as citizens come to know and see is when parliament is disrupted, when there is a lot of noise and not voice. In fact, Prime Minister Gujral complained to the media, that was more than 25 years ago, that when there is a good debate, the media is totally absent. The balconies meant for the fourth estate is zero. No one likes to hear a good debate and report that. And therefore, unfortunately, the only image that we get of our lawmakers is when they disrupt. I am not for one moment trying to justify that, but there are also, see, who is that? The Sardarji who was in the Congress, Rajiv Gandhi's shouting brigade, now in the BJP, the MP from Darjeeling. Aluwalia, yeah, sorry. Aluwalia, every day when parliament is in session, I understand, gets up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and by 6 or 7 finishes reading all the papers digitally, prepares his questions, and comes to parliament. So it is not that parliamentarians or politicians as a class are to be condemned. Some of them are not only good, but better than the best you can imagine. Unfortunately, the image that we get of politicians and parliamentarians is, and maybe the average is not that, those may be the peaks. But you can't exclude, I don't think civil servants can discuss the law there. It has to be by your and my representatives. The civil servants, of course, provide all the necessary material. And that is why you also have the concept of committees. Yes, of course, unfortunately now, bills that are referred to the committees have becoming less and less. In the committee rooms, not only civil servants, you and I can also go and represent. The hearing is excellent. See, these are things which we don't know. Even we lawyers are no match to the parliamentarians even to discuss legal issues sometimes. The way they put questions. Not to trouble you, but to extract the best from you. So the concept is not only not bad, it is quite good. We must work it out better, is what I would like to say. I think.
Thank you, sir.
One way of probably improving the quality is to, please sit down, please sit down, is probably to reduce the amount of publicity that is given to these disruptive activities. Long ago, I was the director of information publicity here when the speaker wanted to install television cameras in the assembly. I was then itself worried that this may lead to members of the legislative assembly behaving in a certain fashion because they want to catch the attention of the people as people who are demonstrating their anger, their anguish, or disrupting proceedings, etc. The optics of the whole thing. But probably we need to appeal to the media to give less and less attention to these disruptive activities and give more and more attention to the actual content of the debate that goes on whenever there is a debate. Very learned debates do take place actually. And as Mr. Pai mentioned, I have appeared before some parliamentary committees and legislature committees. Legislators do listen to all kinds of opinions from the opposite side, from the civil servant side, from public representatives not in the legislature. They listen, they discuss all that is possible. But when they come before the cameras, something gets into them. So that's because they think that all of us appreciate that kind of behavior. So that needs to, that perception of theirs. So you watch on BBC parliamentary debates of House of Commons. They don't do this because they know that their public detests that kind of unruly behavior on their part. But we seem to somehow like some of these dramatics. So it is, some change is required in our own way of looking at these things, and we must send that message that we don't like this kind of dramatics.
Thank you to all the panelists for this enlightening discussion. My question is for Anita ma'am. I very much liked your analogy of Dai Handi, but women are missing in that sport and fun. Maybe we should have encourage girls to do that balancing act of that exercise. That apart, my question is from your own work and research, how do you see technology and technology policy bringing in a paradigm shift in the sphere of gender in development? You've done amazing work. If you can just explain a bit on that.
There are two things. One is that policies on technology and policies on gender equality, of course, have a very dialectical relationship. So the way there are social perceptions, institutional investments, and public policies on gender equality. And if I may add to your theory of change, I would say the first part is not even the input. The first part is a set of premises and assumptions that feed the input. So perhaps if one were to start with what you said, if I believe that if there is a voucher-based system and the vouchers are going to go to the sons in the house, then the question is, if we then say through some big data analysis and machine learning systems, anyway those remote schools nobody attends, let us shut it down. You're likely to see perhaps in the context of a country like ours with social norms as they are, which are gender unequal, drop in the enrollment of women. Suppose you say, kuch bhi nahi hai, there is no voucher, please just send her there. Maybe girls will go there. What came out during the pandemic in our, we run a, we are part of the National Education Emergency Coalition. You can see that it's put up on the website because, there's this idea of a health emergency. We created this as education emergency. What you actually find is the school is the last bastion for safety, physical safety of children. So house helps and domestic helps who had to come to work and who left their girl children back home really felt that the home was unsafe. So we actually live in a society that's like this. So if you actually ask me about technology, policy, and gender, we are talking about that, that cream or whatever, where we want startups 10,000 startups for women, etc. For me, I think the idea of an integrated approach where gender equality, there's no two thoughts about it, where social norms allow, that very famous U curve, right, in economics. In India, you have higher education of women and higher educational attainment of women, but you don't see them, in the employment market. And that is because women actually withdraw themselves, or families force women to withdraw themselves at certain points, because we are a country where there is no social care infrastructure. Secondly, we are a country that's so patriarchal that we believe that bringing up children is primarily the woman's responsibility. So, I mean, I'm saying very obvious things in this forum, but I think that that is one part of the story. The second part, I think, is the way in which visions of technology are structured as instruments of public interest and public good. Those visions will influence the way there can be a disruptive, in a positive sense, a disruptive influence of technology towards gender equality. So when you actually start thinking about technology not as a way to extract value out of consumers, but as a way actually to reconfigure, public value and social value. Let's say sending information at the right time, in a way at the last mile for first trimester women to have, let's say, vaccination, or such things. So the application of technology and the vision of technology through public investments as an instrument of public interest, I think that should really be at the base of it.
Good evening. I'm Rudrugoda. I have a question for Ravindra sir and Srinivasa sir. So, considering the socio-economic problems in the present world, how do we address equity, equality, justice for the right implementation of laws which leads to a good governance?
Rather complicated question. I think this has been answered by all the speakers in some way or the other. Socio-economic problems, and they have highlighted, for instance, the inequalities, economic inequalities as well as social inequalities, which today is perhaps, in a way, the most explosive issue facing the country. Anything can happen. But how do we address them? I think that is the real question, administration, whether it's so some refer to, for instance, the importance of policy making, questions of implementation. Both are important. See, the right policy is also important, formulating the right policy. Otherwise, if you go wrong in the policy implementation, also will go wrong. Sometimes the policy may be good, but still implementation suffers, which Srinivas Murthy has explained why things do go wrong in the actual implementation part. So that is where the importance of good governance comes in. How do you ensure good governance? What exactly is governance? It is actually, you see, one is the policy plus implementation, I would say, or enforcement. If you take the question of law, see, democracy first and foremost is the rule of law. But then, in practice, what are we finding? See, still the majority, it's ruled by, rule of law still prevails. Otherwise, we would be a chaotic society. See, majority of the people do follow the law. But it is the few, who want to disrupt law, who want to, disrupt things in society, whether it is on grounds of religion, caste, community, all these things, You see, it is the minority, I would say, minority of the bad people or the wrong thinking people who are holding sway. When we are speaking about trolling and social media, see, after all, how many? Those who are writing that may be bad, but the majority of the people are good. See, we want peace. We want a peaceful environment to do our own work, but the majority is silent. That silent, the real problem today is between the silent majority, which is good, versus the vocal majority, which is bad, which is evil, I would say. And unless the silent majority asserts itself, I think it is very difficult to put things back. I mean, that is where I think all the discussion is really centering around, the importance of civil society, for instance. Almost all of them emphasize the importance of the people's role. I mean, what can people do about it? it is said, I think it was Martin Luther King who said, the tragedy of the world is not so much the majority speaking, it is the silence of the minority, silence of the good. He said, silence of the good is worse than the evil of the bad. You see, if you don't just come out and say, I mean, this is wrong and this is the right thing to be done, and that is what is happening today. We know many things going wrong politically. So the answer lies in many things, and see now, for instance, everyone spoke about the institutions, particularly the institutions of parliament, executive, and judiciary. And of course, the executive includes the bureaucracy also. I mean, the role of these institutions has somewhat deteriorated over the years from being really highly positive, to which both these speakers referred to. See, in the earlier days after independence, during the 50s and 60s, I also recall debates in parliament used to be very enlightened, and as I said, their mutual respect for each other, the members. And very often I would say that, even controversial issues, which were explosively debated, would get resolved through a sense of humor. Today, that sense of humor is missing. For instance, I recall one particular incident. You would have heard of Acharya Kriplani. He was a great parliamentarian, socialist, and so he had a very, cut and dry sense of humor. His wife also was a politician. Sucheta Kriplani was the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. First woman chief minister. See, this Kriplani was not in Congress. He was a member of the Socialist Party or Praja Social, whatever it was called then. But Kriplani, happened to walk away to the Congress. So somebody in the parliament, when Kriplani was debating, condemning the Congress in in sort of language, which he himself could do. One Congress member stood up and said, "But your own wife is in the Congress party on the other side." Then Kriplani said, "Well, I didn't know the congressman would kidnap my wife and carry my own wife, to their side." So like this, and the whole debate, ended there. I mean, this is the thing. Even in state assemblies, for instance, in Karnataka Assembly, I remember, J.H. Patel was the chief minister. He may be remembered for certain wrong things, but he was a very good parliamentarian, one of the best in the state assemblies. And, very often he would just resolve a number of problems or, the questions raised by others through a simple sense of humor. And the whole debate would end there. So, this respect not only for each other in parliament, I would say even in society. See, in society we forget that, how do we treat others? We also, cultivating a lot of hatred, animosity, and on various grounds. So coming together, I think that of the people is very important. We speak about the importance of civil society. In fact, my own view about the empowerment of the people, or the role of the people, is getting strengthened by what I hear. But there is one problem in civil society. See, the different groups, whether the NGOs or other associations, they are not able to come together and project a united view in order to overcome evil, as I said. Even amongst them, there are so many differences. I find even in resident welfare association, with which I am familiar, but there are so many differences even on a small civic problem and all that. So these are the things, where when we speak about implementation, there is a role of the the politicians, the bureaucrats, and the people also. So whether all of them will gel together, that may be the real questions or the imperative for the future. Anyone else? I think I already made my concluding remarks. In a sense, if you want to say something?
No, I don't have a question. I just want to congratulate the panel for what was a brilliant, thought provoking, sagacious, and perspicacious discussion. The second thing I want to say, I think we should give them a round of applause for the excellent discussion, very high quality. Second thing I want to say is this is just the beginning of a conversation. So we will continue to engage with each one of you because I think it's going to be very important to look at the Constitution. We are very soon going to be releasing the Public Affairs Index 2022, which is our flagship product. And I'll ask Anjana, who's the team lead, to just mention briefly in a minute what it's about.
Thank you so much. Sorry for slightly hijacking the objective of this event today. But I'd like to see this as a curtain raiser for what is to come in the Public Affairs Index of 2022. We see a great shift every year. We release the Public Affairs Index, and 2022 is the 7th edition of this annual report. Here we are trying to locate governance of different states within the base of the Constitution, precisely justice. We're trying to invoke economic, political, and social justice and try to see how the states in India fare if they were judged on the basis of what they are supposed to do. And no better way to look at what they're supposed to do than go back to the Constitution. We're also seeing a methodological shift from the principal component analysis that we've used so far to something slightly different called the multi-criteria decision-making model. I wouldn't want to give out too much, and I'd cut my word short with this, and like to say that please see this event as a curtain raiser to the Public Affairs Index of 2022.
Thank you. Well, I think we have had a very, very interesting, exciting, and thought-provoking discussions. I think all the four speakers, brought out excellent presentations and issues raised, and I'm so happy that there is so much response. I mean, the type of questions asked and even the other views expressed and all that. Well, let me conclude again going back to social contract, which we began. I won't like to reiterate whatever has been already said by the speakers, except I think Srinivas Murthy reminded us about the social contract that started in ancient times, the Varnashrama Dharma and so on. So we had our own type of contracts, and let us not forget that in ancient India was perhaps the first country which spoke about king's duties. Dharma, what we call dharma today, or in the ancient it has come down, that is the key, I would say. When we speak about justice, what is justice? Economic, political, social. All that is represented in the word dharma. It's not easily translatable. And we see, these ideas about, good governance being represented, being echoed in our ancient texts. For instance, right from Agni Purana, there is a famous, Agni Purana says that a king or the ruler should ensure that the right person, who has committed a crime or a wrong is punished, and also ensure that a person who has not done any wrong is not punished. This is a concept of justice again. And again, whether it is, even if go to the epics like both Ramayana and Mahabharata, there are expositions about king's duties and dharma and all that. Vasishta Ramayana is full of that. Similarly, when Bharata goes to the forest, where Rama is staying, in order to first persuade him to come back, but he said, no, you won't come back. But he tells Bharata, explains to him how he should rule, how people should be protected, how justice should be, given, and how the welfare of the people should always be the heart of the king. Similarly, in Mahabharata, we find Bhishma expounding, the principles of justice to Yudhishthira when he was on his deathbed. So one can go on Arthashastra itself, Kautilya's Arthashastra. A lot of details about statecraft and all that is there. So I think we should, in a way, we are not able to express or expound all these things to the common people at large, mainly because one great inequality in India is the difference between the English educated and the non-English educated, who are in a majority. See, we all speak about in English and about the concepts with the Western thinkers and even Constitution. I mean, Constitution makers were influenced by British English ideas, and so it is those words that we are using. But if you go to a village and speak about justice, Constitution, nobody will understand. You speak about Dharma, what is stated in Ramayana, and then relate it to the present, I think they will be able to appreciate it better. So I think while carrying the message of whatever we discussed today, it all depends on how we, Srinivas Murthy, you spoke about interpretation and reinterpretation of the Constitution. So a reinterpretation of the Constitution in our own language, using our own tradition and ideas, etc., is also, I would say, extremely important. So with these few words, let me say the the social contract about which all of them spoke, I think the 5 imperatives and so on. So I'm sure the PAC, as Mr. Gursharan already said, is going to take this forward. Of course, the PI 22 is one, but even otherwise, how can we really concretize some of the ideas that have been expressed today and re-emphasize the role of the civil society, bring them into the domain of articulation, so that more and more people are able to express and support the idea of justice, which is really the true summum bonum of our constitution. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It's been an enlightening evening. I hope all of you gained from this as much as I did personally. So thank you very much for coming today, and thank you all the panelists for your enlightening views. Thank you for attending, and wishing everyone a 75th Independence Day in advance. Thank you.